President William Ruto is asking Gen Z protesters not to burn their country in what appeared to be a departure from his usually abrasive style. The president seemingly implored protesters to become part of the solution, saying they were sending the country down a dangerous path where there would be no country. He blamed the protests on opponents who he said wanted power at all costs. The president termed the protests on Wednesday as calculated chaos and economic sabotage. He was addressing Wednesday's June 25th anniversary protests that resulted in the deaths of more than 15 people.
What if the men in uniform stopped following orders? Not out of treason, but because their conscience awoke before the nations. What if the line between power and protest disappeared in the eyes of those sworn to uphold it? This is not just another uprising. It is a mirror held to the soul of leadership. In Kenya, the ones shouting, "Enough," were not rebels, they were enforcers. While in Burkina Faso, the streets remained quiet, not because of fear, but because of faith. Two nations, two silences, one rooted in exhaustion, the other in resolve. Stay with us. Because behind these headlines lies a decision Africa must make, not just for today, but for every child yet to ask, what happened to us? To answer that, we must go back to where silence first turned into signal. In July 2024, Nairobi did not awaken to the hum of politics. It woke to the thunder of boots pounding pavement. But these were not security drills. They were defections. Thousands of Kenyan paramilitary police, stripped of privilege and patience, marched not in defense of the government, but in protest against it. Some tore off their uniforms before the world's cameras. Others simply stood still and said, "No more." What drove the state's enforcers to abandon their posts was not ideology, but erosion of salaries, of dignity, of trust. IMF loans had arrived, but so had austerity, and with it came silence from those in power, and screams from those once ordered to suppress them. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, another picture emerged. There, a leader stood not above the people, but among them. No script, no motorcade, just questions and listening. While Kenyan officers walked away from a system, Ibrahim Traoré walked into his people's pain. The headlines captured the drama, but the truth lay deeper in how two nations, faced with identical flames, chose either to fuel the fire or to kindle renewal. To understand why their paths diverged, we must follow the fracture lines, beginning where order began to break. They did not carry placards. They did not chant slogans. They walked. Kenya's police officers, the very symbol of state authority, marched not for law, but for liberation. Their uniforms, once signs of discipline, became reminders of betrayal. In the heart of Nairobi, they laid down badges like burdens, turning the national crest into a silent indictment. This was not a mutiny. It was a mourning. A farewell to the illusion that those who protect are themselves protected. Their anger was not abstract, it was personal. Salaries had disappeared into delays. Bonuses vanished into spreadsheets. The cost of food doubled while promises halved. And the loans, those infamous billions from international lenders, came with fine print written in bloodless, inky austerity, cuts, suffering. A government desperate to appease the IMF had amputated its own limbs. The police were no longer enforcers. They had become evidence of a system that eats its own. What made this moment historic was not just the uniforms on the ground, but what they revealed, that when the guardians of a nation stop believing in what they guard, collapse begins, not with gunfire, but with doubt. In radio interviews, officers spoke not of rebellion, but of conscience. "We are not the enemy," one said. "We simply refuse to pretend any longer." Another whispered, "If we protect a system that breaks us, are we still serving the people?" Their questions ignited something deeper than outrage. It sparked recognition. Civil servants who had stayed silent began to stir. Teachers, hospital workers, clerks, those once separated by job titles, now stood on the same side of a growing moral divide. Protests followed, but they were not explosions. They were convergences. No central leader, no manifesto, just one word repeated like a heartbeat: enough. But Kenya's leadership did not respond with dialogue. It responded with detachment. The president's televised remarks, urging Gen Z not to burn their country, felt less like empathy and more like exile. He spoke as though he were watching from a safe distance, and so the void widened. In universities, students stopped waiting for curricula to change. They hosted open forums, translating IMF contracts into Swahili, demystifying the debt deals that shaped their lives without consent. On social media, young creators built infographics, timelines, and open data portals, exposing patterns of foreign dependency. Even TikTok, once a playground for trends, became a classroom for awakening. They were not rioting, they were reorganizing. If you have ever questioned a system that asks for your silence in exchange for survival, then this is not just Kenya's story. It is yours. Would you stay loyal to a symbol that no longer serves your soul? Would you stand quiet in a uniform that mutes your dignity? Comment below. Not because you must, but because silence is no longer an option. What emerged from this fracture was not just protest. It was proof. Proof that collapse does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives gently through the eyes of a soldier who chooses not to strike. In the countryside, something even more unsettling unfolded. Officers stopped enforcing evictions. Some escorted farmers back to repossessed land. Others mediated community disputes instead of escalating them. They had not become anarchists. They had become citizens. And that shift, subtle, profound, irreversible, revealed the real cost of policy without participation. Because when power forgets people, people remember their power. Kenya was not just facing economic decay. It was confronting an existential truth that a nation cannot govern by policy alone. It must govern by proximity, by nearness to its own people's pain. But the further the state drifted, the louder the people's alignment became. This was not a revolution of ideology. It was a rebellion of memory, a refusal to forget what justice once felt like. But as Kenya trembled from within, another country chose not to protest because it had already begun to rebuild. No parades, no banners, no barricades, and yet something was rising. In Burkina Faso, the absence of noise was not indifference, it was intention. While other nations broadcast their breakdowns in full color, Burkina rebuilt, quietly, persistently from the ground up. In the town of Kaya, beneath a sun-bleached awning, a leader sat, not to speak but to hear. Ibrahim Traoré did not arrive with promises. He arrived with questions. What do you need to keep your children in school? What do you lack to grow your own food? These were not rhetorical exercises. They were frameworks of trust. And trust, in a continent long betrayed by its own leadership, is no small currency. Traoré had turned down IMF loans. But more radically, he had turned toward his people. And instead of protests, he was met with participation. University students volunteered to teach in rural villages. Women organized co-ops to produce local flour. Mechanics fixed water pumps using parts donated from scrapyards. Retired teachers returned to chalkboards, not for pay but for purpose. No central plan, no foreign consultants, just people acting because they believed someone was finally listening. Burkina Faso had not eliminated its problems. Inflation existed, infrastructure was fragile, but the most dangerous disease of governance, disconnection, had been cut off at the root. There was no viral footage of tear gas, no trending hashtags, and yet every day thousands contributed to a quiet movement more powerful than a riot. Self-determination, at a time when leadership elsewhere was confused with visibility. Traoré's invisibility became his strength. He did not speak daily on state TV. He walked villages, sat under trees, listened to the cadence of daily survival, and responded with humility, not hierarchy. In Ouagadougou, architecture students drafted low-cost housing blueprints using clay and bamboo. In Banfora, women taught one another how to process shea butter for export. In the hills of Tenkadogo, elders trained young men to repair irrigation lines. These were not state projects, they were acts of belonging. And perhaps that is where the power truly lies, not in central policy, but in decentralized trust. When citizens are treated as agents, not liabilities, they stop asking permission to care. Have you ever felt more alive not when someone gave you something, but when someone believed you already had it within you. If so, then you understand why Burkina Faso is not rising through charity, but through conviction. Comment not out of obligation, but as a gesture of recognition for what is possible when people are seen. And the education, it did not fade, it transformed. High school students began tutoring one another in weekend shadow schools. Village elders taught oral history beside rivers and under trees. Urban collectives launched open-air science labs built from plywood and chalk. Education was no longer a system, it was a culture. The brilliance of it all was not in sophistication, it was in sincerity. While global analysts downgraded the country's future on spreadsheets, the people of Burkina Faso were upgrading their reality in kilns, in classrooms, in conversations. The message was simple: we may not have funding, but we have faith, and faith is its own economy. Unlike nations where participation must be bought, Burkina's capital was trust, and its dividends were self-started projects, self-funded initiatives, and self-owned progress. It was not romantic, it was rugged, it was not utopia, but it was undeniable. And the world, accustomed to measuring Africa in deficits, struggled to measure something it could not quantify: collective courage. Burkina Faso was not asking for applause. It was asking to be left alone to build. But if one country found strength in the silence of construction, another drowned in the noise of collapse, and both paths now demanded a choice. What happens when two nations face the same storm, but choose opposite shelters? Kenya and Burkina Faso are not stories of difference in geography. They are parables of choice. Two governments, two crises, two definitions of leadership. Kenya, armed with financial backing, turned inward. It listened more to its creditors than to its citizens. With inflation surging, it reached outward. For loans, for conditions, for international approval. And what came in return was predictable austerity, the language of cuts, deferrals, reductions. Burkina Faso, less affluent, turned downward, to the earth, to the people. When faced with the same storm, it chose not insulation but integration. No sweeping reforms from think tanks, just a simple call: let us build together. These choices created two realities, one brittle, one rooted. In Kenya, the state imposed survival. In Burkina Faso, the people offered sacrifice. And herein lies the fracture line running across Africa, not economic but ethical. Not about who has more, but about who trusts more. In Kenya, trust leaked from every institution. Police protested, professors resigned, nurses stopped speaking and started marching. Meanwhile, youth combed through budgets, dissecting every missing dollar like forensic analysts at a crime scene. In Burkina Faso, trust circulated like air, unseen but vital. Students taught before they were certified. Traders pooled goods to feed neighborhoods. Grandmothers gave history lessons beneath trees. Both countries were fighting for their future. But one believed the fight began at home. The other waited for terms from abroad. The irony? Kenya had more money, but Burkina Faso had more momentum. Why? Because when people feel ownership, they act. Not for profit, not for visibility, but for dignity. What would you build if no one gave you permission, but no one stood in your way? What would you protect if the state failed, but your neighbor rose? If those questions stir something inside you, leave your answer below. Because sometimes the smallest comment becomes the loudest ripple. The divide is not merely about governance. It is about worldview. In Kenya, authority speaks in documents. In Burkina Faso, it speaks in presence. Leadership in one country stands behind podiums. In the other, it sits beside firewood stoves. One system disciplines, the other listens. And perhaps that is why the future of Africa will not be written by policies, but by posture. Because people do not rebel when they are poor. They rebel when they are ignored. Traoré's genius was not economic. It was emotional. He recognized that progress is not a plan. It is a feeling. People contribute when they feel they are seen. They revolt when they feel invisible. Kenya's people are not angry because they are lazy. They are angry because they were excluded. Because decisions were made in boardrooms while their homes dimmed under rising fuel prices. In Burkina Faso, the message was, "We need your hands." In Kenya, it was, "Tighten your belt, one invites, one demands." And the response from the people, crystal clear. Kenya's youth began questioning not only the IMF, but the identity of their nation. Who do we serve? They asked. And why are we always asked to endure? In response, Burkina Faso's youth posed a different question. What can we give without being asked? And somewhere between those two inquiries lies the soul of a continent. It is no longer about resources. It is about recognition. Kenya shows us what happens when governments treat people as burdens. Burkina Faso shows us what happens when leaders treat people as builders. The most telling difference: in one country, the police removed their badges. In the other, the people picked up their tools. But as the world watched this contrast unfold, something unexpected began to stir. Not in policy chambers, but in classrooms. Just when analysts began writing the conclusion, Africa again on the brink, another story cracked through the narrative, and it came not from rebellion, but from a blackboard. Burkina Faso, having rejected international loans, suddenly found its universities defunded. Grants vanished, research programs were reevaluated. Foreign education partners pulled out quietly, citing standards and alignment. But the people knew this was not about education. It was about erasure. What could not be stopped on the streets would be suffocated in the classroom. It was not the first time in history that the battleground shifted to the mind. But this time, Africa was ready. Instead of collapse came construction. Professors volunteered, students stayed, mechanics offered technical classes on weekends, farmers ran literacy sessions under the shade of neem trees. And in the absence of foreign syllabi, local knowledge emerged like buried treasure. Villages built their own curricula. Children learned about soil, rainfall, market negotiation. Elders taught philosophy through fables. Engineers shared practical design through scavenged materials. Education became something no international donor could measure: a movement. In Kurugo, a community ran a night school with candlelight. In Ziniare, teenagers recorded math lessons by radio. In the capital, a group of mothers designed a teaching manual in 3 languages, none of them colonial. This was not merely survival, it was sovereignty. And the message it carried was unmistakable. You can downgrade our ratings, but you cannot downgrade our resolve. Have you ever learned something no system taught you, yet knew it was the truth? If your answer is yes, then you understand why education is no longer compliance. It is resistance. Tell us below, what truth would you teach if no one told you what to say? But the story does not end in Burkina Faso. In Kenya, the fire reached the libraries. Students who had once protested in the streets now began to question what they had been taught. Why were they reading about foreign economies while their own went unexamined? Why were policies taught as if they were inevitable? University forums turned into policy labs. Study groups uncovered hidden debt clauses. Hashtags gave way to handbooks. The question was no longer what should we learn. It became who decides what we are allowed to know. This was the twist no government saw coming. It was not the sound of marching boots. It was the quiet defiance of pens scratching paper, of chalk striking stone. And in that silence, a louder resistance emerged, not against leaders, but against intellectual obedience. A continent once told it was not ready to govern itself had begun the most radical act of all thinking on its own terms. Now the question is no longer about protests or presidents. It is about what each of us will pass on, obedience or ownership. In the end, nations are not remembered for how loud they shouted, but for how clearly they thought. A badge laid on the pavement in Nairobi, a lesson whispered under a tree in Ouagadougou. 2 gestures, 1 revolution. Leadership is not about being followed. It is about being understood. And education, true education, is not memorizing what others want you to know. It is remembering who you are when the world tries to forget you. Burkina Faso chose to build. Kenya chose to ask why. But the final choice, the one that matters, belongs to us. Because in every village, every city, every screen, the question remains, What will we teach our children when the textbooks run out and only memory remains? If this story stirred something within you, do not let it stop at emotion. Transform it into reflection, into voice, into action. Comment your thoughts. Share this message. And if you believe that knowledge belongs to the people, then let this channel be your classroom. Because the truest revolution begins not in the streets, but in the mind.